that are working on interoperability inside of K-12. There was definitely, when I talked about y'all, it was totally like, really? We want to know, we want to know more, but they're so heads down trying to even pull this off inside of our own one. They had no idea. So I was able to confirm, that the awareness of what's going on in the world was not there. But then again, you all didn't know we were working on it either. So it's kind of interesting. So I think this is incredibly important, what we're doing, getting all of these sectors to understand that we're all working on it and come up with use cases that show why it is important for us to be exchanging data in whatever is the most appropriate form across the different sectors. But I'm fascinated to hear what you heard, Dave, because you're an outsider, and it's kind of like your viewpoint will be much more valid than mine because you can see the whole landscape.
Yeah, I was actually only there for one day, but was there for the complete day. So I went to a couple of sessions, and then I spent some time in the exhibit hall, and I was very surprised by how big that conference was, and certainly how big the exhibit hall was. It was very, very significant. I think the sense that I got was something like 20,000 people attend that conference, which took me by surprise. I am not an education expert, but I did talk to many people, and the observations that I came away with was it was a little bit like the Wild West. There were vendors there, Apple and Google and many, many smaller players. And they were very focused on the products that they were bringing to the education marketplace. Here's how you can use these tools. Here's how we're addressing learning and so forth. But I heard very little about sharing of data or interoperability. I had a conversation with one lady from Colorado who was saying that I was asking her how they share data, and she said that if it is within the district, they can share the data. But once you get outside of the district, there is no capabilities to share data. So if a student moves to a different district, for example, they, according to her, they need to fax the information over to them about the new student and so forth. She saw the advantage in data sharing. So that was my observation, where there was not a big focus on data sharing. And I'm going to reach back to you, Elliot, at the appropriate time to talk about Project Unicorn and other areas of data sharing. I saw a need there for data sharing, but again, I'm just getting introduced certainly to the education marketplace. So if anybody else other than Elliot has some experience, some expertise in education, would you let us know?
This is Adam. I don't want to take up the whole meeting with this, but I do have one question of Elliot, excuse me, and anybody else who might have expertise to answer it. And that is there no conversation around this and no real activity around it because they sort of don't know about it? What the heck is interoperability kind of thing, where lots of us were not long ago? Or is it primarily because there are so many privacy issues in their minds that they just figure it's not anything that they can realistically do?
It's a good question. The answer is both, depending upon your role and responsibility within the education sector. So if you're in a district, your awareness completely depends upon what your role is around data. So teachers, principals, superintendents, oftentimes, for them, it never comes up. They have other people that handle it, so they think that it can't be done, although they wish it was easier. Those that are working on it are the organizations like, the IT, that hold the IT directors. Vendors, oftentimes we are definitely having a war around the fact that most of the vendors think they own the data. And the districts are now realizing that no, because the students they're the guardians and ownership of the data. So we're just starting to see the push now. What does it mean actually the student owns the data? So yeah, I don't know. And it's funny, I've got many more conversations with these guys because I've known them forever, but there are lots of things around operability if you look at K-12, but it just depends upon who's talking about it. And there are definitely factions for whom it won't matter. It'll happen, and their lives will be improved. Did that answer, Adam, what you asked?
I was on mute. Yeah, it does. It does. I'm just trying to figure out going forward, what are our opportunities there and how do we approach them? Because I think we all probably would agree that education as a sector or domain or whatever we call it, is integral in the social determinants and lots of the things that we do. They cross into that territory, and it's really important to understand the territory.
Yeah, Mars and I are working with all of those organizations for whom they're actually laying the groundwork and doing the pieces of it. So all the members of Project Unicorn, the COSIN, ISTE's in it to a degree, but you'll find like groups like AASA, they're starting to understand why it's important. But yeah, Mars and I have all of those. They are who we deal with frequently.
Okay.
So, Elliot, very, very briefly, can you say what Project Unicorn is?
Oh, good heavens, I just met with them. Project Unicorn is something that we voluntarily sign on to. We take a pledge saying that data interoperability is important and that we are going to work towards it. So it's made up of organizations who are starting to understand what it is, and we're building the coalition to move it forward. We're actually working on identifying the various standards that are needed, because we're kind of like, I don't know if healthcare and everybody else is the same way, but we've got, IMS Global, we've got A4L, we've got standards around lots of little things, and we're trying to get all of them in the same page and actually even build out a dictionary that says these guys cover this, these guys cover that. And the vendors are all, of course, moaning and groaning because every time we write a standard, they've got to comply because they've got to use it when they sell to us.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. Maybe you can try and keep us informed as to where those efforts are going over time and make sure that they don't have issues that we're not looking at addressing. In other words, there may be some uniqueness in education that we need to concern ourselves with that isn't applicable to other human services and social determinants. So,
absolutely, that is absolutely on the top of the list for Marcely and I, and that's one of the reasons why we joined y'all, because we're going, for us, and with Adam and Daniel, we know exactly why we should be exchanging data at the right time with the right people about the right thing. And it's now literally getting down to getting these organizations to understand this isn't about everything. This is about a few very specific use cases that would make it easier for people and organizations. So glad to do that.
Super. Appreciate it.
Hey, Dave and Elliot, this is Chris from ACF.
Hey, Chris.
I just wanted to say that this is an area that's of keen interest to me and also my agency. A lot of touch points, as you know, especially between like early childhood programs like Head Start and also the child welfare programs. And we've had some interaction with the Department of Ed on some of this. And I just wanted to mention two things real quick. One is their grant program for states to develop statewide longitudinal data systems around educational outcomes. And that's something we've been trying to think about. How can we tap into that or expand that somewhat so that we can include outcomes related to other factors and kind of build on those investments that Ed has made at the states. And the other piece is some of their standards work, something called the Common Educational Data Standard, or CEDS. And my understanding is that's primarily a standard that assists with the local education agencies reporting data up the chain to the states and eventually to the feds.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily a direct, like, case level data sharing kind of thing. But I have really great relationships with the folks that have built CEDS and some of the tools around that. So, and I know they were looking for opportunities at one point for how they could better align or maybe even integrate that work with NIM. So that's sort of a floating offer on their part to collaborate on that further.
No, let's
So if
definitely
that's relevant, I'm happy to open that up.
Yeah, let's definitely talk, because I think one of the things that Marceline and I are realizing, and I think because of what Daniel and Adam have done, you guys have done better mapping of what's already out there and who's doing what. ISTE, just sitting at the one table on the first day, there was this, I had to literally ask, could you just put it in a grid showing which organization writes the standards around what and in what circumstances, so that we've got it in a very simple grid format. That does, some of it's going back to that, like, things keep popping up that nobody's heard of, or one person does, and it's like, why isn't it in a common place for all of us to see the landscape? So Chris, that would be absolutely wonderful if we could connect and figure out how to do that, because I think if we could come up with that grid, it would help everybody in all sectors to see where the interconnections might be with K-12, much less higher education.
And I honestly think a lot of that lack of awareness is resulting from the fact that these efforts are pretty narrowly scoped.
Yes.
They're not trying to map the world. No. So they're trying to just, address the immediate needs of their communities. But I think this kind of group could be really helpful in kind of bringing the broader perspective. And here's how we could expand this out and make it relevant for more communities, or to improve the way we communicate across communities. So I think we can get there, but I think that's the reason it's been sort of, tucked away in the shadows, because they're really not trying to address some of these bigger issues that we're discussing, but I think they probably should be looking in that direction.
Well, and I've actually I'm talking to those organizations, and I started with Keith Kruger, who's the president of COSIN, the Consortium for School Networking, which all the ed tech directors belong to. And I talked to CETA, the State Education Tech Directors Association. I actually talked about NIC and the fact that it would be worthwhile for them to go out and look at what NIC is doing and thinking about joining. But rather than bring a whole lot of, I don't want to say spare people because that doesn't sound right, but a lot of organizations, and it's almost like, okay, who are the key ones, because we've got so many, that can aggregate the others and do some of that, or it suddenly becomes even more of a free-for-all, and you get too many cooks spoil the soup. So,
hey, Chris, it's Adam. What do you see? What's a possible next step there to really follow up on this? Hello?
Sorry, I was having a bite of food.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
I would try to turn that around and say what would be most helpful, because I can help make connections with the right people, but it kind of depends on what we want to do and where we want to go and how ready we are for certain conversations.
Hey, well, Chris, Paul, have you gotten with those discussions? Would it be possible for us to develop a kind of a single, simple use case that could turn into a proof of concept demo or something for an exchange based on what the work they're doing in education with some of the other things? I'm thinking about even something like the home visiting program, making an exchange with education.
Well, I would love that, the more use cases, because I'm actually working with San Diego to build a use case around the Department of Ed for the county, and human services, because we've got to have examples that show people why it's valuable, what data should be shared, and why it would make everybody's lives easier and benefit the individual. So I couldn't agree more.
Let me ask, excuse me, there's certainly technical people in the ed world. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I wonder, I like the idea of a use case a lot. We need to figure that out. But just so we are sort of moving ahead and not wondering what's next, and I don't know if this is a good idea, so I'm putting it out. But what if we invite somebody technical? Elliot, you would have to find that person who has technical knowledge and interest. Okay. And Chris, if maybe we can connect through you to get someone comparable, with comparable interests and skills, and invite them to these meetings. I mean, just so that we maintain that as a real concrete connection and keep it on our radar.
The guy I would suggest is oh, sorry, Paul. Just real quick, I think the guy that I'm thinking of is Jim Campbell, who works for AEM Corporation, and they were contracted to Ed to do some of the technical work around CEDS, and he's got kind of the broad perspective and the technical depth. So that would be my suggestion.
So maybe an introduction?
Yep, I can do that.
That would be great. Thank you. Elliot, you think of anybody who attended the conference or who you deal with, in a substantive way that might also be interested in this group? I just think that bringing them in, not only does that keep them on our radar, but I believe that they would hear things that would resonate, and they say, they could see ideas, hear ideas that they might want to take home.
Oh, I agree. I think the one or two key people, absolutely. I was thinking of the 50 or 60 that I run across and going, whoa, no. Let me look. I'm going to look at who's in Project Unicorn and COSIN. And my guess is it's going to be somebody from one of those two groups.
Well, another source of wisdom about this is the people from the Silicon Valley Regional Data Trust, which is a information sharing system built on the backs of education, but involving social welfare and juvenile justice and across the same domains that we're talking about in NIC. That system's supposed to go live, I've been told, in September, and they've actually built the capability to share across education and social services, and encountered a lot of these problems, and I think there's a need for them to share what they've found and done and how that can help the rest of the world.
Well, they were one of NIC's founding organizations, so we know them. We can reach out to them separately.
What's the name of that group? Silicon Valley.
Yeah, it is Silicon Valley RDT. Go on. Sorry. Go on.
Silicon Valley Regional Data Trust.
Okay.
I mean, we don't have to speculate on the stuff that they can describe the use cases that they're actually implementing.
Yeah. Yep. And they have architecture, and they have written agreements, and they have a bunch of stuff. They're pretty,
I agree. If you're looking for use cases, that's a great place to start.
Super. So let me, what I would like to do on today's call is introduce a couple of the fundamentals about interoperability and data sharing. There's plenty of room for engagement by different individuals. And even as we were talking a moment ago, interoperability, if everybody does it a different way, then we really haven't achieved very much. The key is to get on board with a set of standards that's going to allow us to truly be interoperable. So if we look at And I'm sure, you know, I applaud anybody else. I just put down some initial thoughts. When you look at why we would strive towards interoperability, a couple of the things are that it can achieve a very much more client-focused or client-centric experience. So an example of that might be if somebody is looking for their information, they may want to look in several repositories or do something with the information. So it's not me logging on to this portal to be able to interact with this repository. It's more, hey, there are many repositories that applications can gain access to, and therefore have a very much more client-focused example. And we all see that on our smartphones today. We're seeing it more in, well, certainly in tablets and so forth. So having a client-focused experience brings a lot of value to the party. And in order to do that, you really need to look for something called APIs, or application programming interfaces, that allow access to these individual resources. And they are where, certainly where healthcare is going, and where many other sectors of the economy are going to as well. Having cloud-centric services with the data in there that a variety of user experiences can be able to access and reach out and aggregate that information for the client. One of the things that I did hear out at the ISTE conference was that in some cases, sustainability is an issue. In other words, a school district buying a solution from a vendor, and then they can't either afford to keep that solution current or buy another solution for them. So it's kind of lock in to a vendor where individual districts and counties are negotiating contracts with a specific vendor who is going to handle everything for them. And they have no transition strategy, no exit strategy to go on to a different solution unless they have a good deal of money. So these these cloud-based solutions can be much more cost-effective as you look at particular services that go to make up the whole, in the end, being accessible and being much more cost effective. I mean, we can see it all day in apps that we use, Google Maps, Gmail, whatever the case may be. Implementing on a cloud-based infrastructure that is scalable, in other words, it can start out small and then grow, is certainly an advantage. And one of the big issues that I see is that it is an enabler of emerging technologies like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so forth. Those technologies themselves, we'll pick on artificial intelligence for a moment, are not good or bad in themselves. It is up to groups like this to say, let's use them for good purposes. Even having said that, though, it is access to data that really brings these emerging technologies into effectiveness. It needs to be able to have the data. Could be data on students, could be data on people in healthcare, social determinants, and so forth. But these emerging technologies, which are really very, very impressive, need that data. So there needs to be people that understand privacy of the data, can make sure that the solutions that are going to deploy things like artificial intelligence or machine learning have a genuine need for that information, and the information is secured, so not everybody can have access to it. And as I was saying earlier, applications can consist of multiple sources of information, and we're seeing that more and more on mobile phones, tablets, and so forth, where you're accessing an application on that device, but that device is then going out to multiple data sources to be able to bring that together into something meaningful to the client who is using it. So those are just some first thoughts that I have on why we would go down the interoperability path. There's many more that we can add to it, but I think the point that I made a few moments ago, if we all develop different concepts of interoperability, then you haven't achieved anything. You'll never achieve interoperability unless the people who are offering the solutions are adhering to a set of standards so that you can write an application accessing multiple repositories of information. So I think this group, Stewards of Change in general, can certainly keep us on track as to what the emerging standards are for things like moving the data from point A to point B, or security, authentication, authorization, and so forth, to try and keep the standards in focus so we do achieve this interoperability. What I'm thinking, and I'm very much open to suggestions, is that the facets that this group could start to look at are, as we were saying in the conversation a bit ago, was use cases and the value afforded by those use cases. I think in order to get momentum and to keep moving forward, we need to understand how to bring value out of being able to access this data in a variety of ways. So use cases, I'm sure, is something that all domain experts that are on this call can help us understand where is a use case that can bring value and that is simple enough for us to achieve in a reasonable period of time. One of the issues that we have faced in healthcare is that in the past, we have certainly tried to boil the ocean. In other words, take on too many things, and it becomes too complex and too unfocused, and all of a sudden you're not actually achieving any value. I think for us to understand some use cases where there is true value, I'm not sure where they are, others on the phone would probably know better than I, what they are. The other more technical areas that I think we're going to need to address is...
Dave, excuse me, 10 secs. I'm going to interrupt it very, very briefly. And go to use cases, kick something into my brain that I'd forgotten, and I don't want to get it lost, and we'll get off the meeting without saying it. So we talked about use cases with SVRDT. Daniel reminded me that San Diego County has also been sharing information, which I think with child welfare, human services, so there might be ready access to a use case or the material for one with people we're already engaged with. That's all. I just want to get that on the table.
No, that's great. Thanks. Thanks, Adam. So I think that's something that everybody on this call could participate in. What is a use case that brings some value and clarity to the industry industry on what that value is, and yet not be so complex that it would take way too long to actually implement it. We need to be able to show value in a reasonable period of time. So when you look at what the use cases are, how are we going to be able to exchange that information in a meaningful way? I think there are a number of topics that that actually translate very easily from the healthcare space into the human services and social determinants. It is foundational to what the internet does, and that is understanding the transport. How do we get information from point A to point B? And you know, HTTPS is a protocol that allows that sharing and is dominant in the industry, is an obvious candidate for that. But then you look at things like authentication and authorization, and they get a little bit more complex. And I'll bet everybody on the phone has got some frustrations with authentication. That is the ability, and we'll use Adam as the example. If Adam is trying to access some data, how do we prove that that is really Adam Pertman that we're talking to? And the most common way of doing that now is usernames and passwords. There's many issues there, and I'm sure we're all frustrated with changing our usernames and keeping them within the guidelines of whatever that website wants to have, you know, 5 alphas, 2 numerics, special characters, all that stuff. But there are other standards out there, things like FIDO and SMART. SMART is specific to the fire transports, but a means to authenticate that, yes, this is really Adam that we're talking to. And then the second piece, which is the authorization piece, is so now what is Adam allowed to do with my data? So in the case of education, if it's looking at somebody's transcripts or whatever the case may be in education, for that particular piece of information, Adam needs to be authorized. Now that we know it's Adam, Adam needs to be authorized to have access to that data. And even more specifically, Adam may be able to read the data, but not be able to update the data, as an example. And those two pieces, authentication and authorization, if you can't achieve some level of standardization to how to do that, then interoperability is going to be very, very challenged and have difficulty living up to what its potential may be. So those are some underlying things that we need to educate ourselves on. What I would say is, to an item here, these are pretty darn transferable from the healthcare space into the human services space. They don't address business issues. They're just infrastructure. How do you move data, and how do you make sure you're moving data to people that are authorized to be able to see it? So those are issues that we can get a lot of knowledge from other industries. Could be banking, certainly in my case, very focused on healthcare. But then there is another challenge. Once we've understood the use cases, there is the data consensus. What does the data look like that we're moving from point A to point B? And that's where we start to get very specific to industries and to specific use cases. So some of, in the healthcare space right now, people are looking very much at FHIR as a means to be able to transfer the information. As a matter of fact, there is an initiative called the Gravity Project that is trying to define social determinants questionnaires, if you will, in a fire-based approach. The other thing that we need to focus in on is something called NIM. And Paul and Chris are much more advanced on NIM than I am, but it seems like we really need to understand how to embrace NIM on this interoperability and data sharing. You know, some of the conversations that we've had with EP3 would indicate to me that there may be a way to fairly easily blend those standards together. Whether that actually can happen, we'll have to see, but it is one of the challenges that we've got. For example, in education, what does a student record look like? And it's going to have multiple elements in it and so forth. But again, if you're not defining what those standards are, then you'll never achieve interoperability. You'll exchange data, but no way to do anything of real value with the data. And then there's some additional things such as testing.
Dave, I'm going to interrupt you just one more time. Sorry about that. I want to talk about Neiman Fire for a second, just to get a sense of the group. It seems to me that this is central enough a question and important enough that it might be worth being a tutorial / a discussion on one of our meetings soon, so that we all know this is a technical group. You'll get it better than I will. But it seems to me that's a conversation that's worth having at some point. We have good, people who understand these things very well on this call. I hear Paul had a very interesting conversation about Neiman Fire the other night on the West Coast. And I think people have both opinion and information that might be genuinely interesting to all of us and strong as background. So real quick, would that be, to people's minds on this call, a good topic of conversation during one of our meetings here? Don't all yell at once.
So there is the NIM community of health has been working on this integration and mutual coexistence between FHIR and NIM, and getting those people to come and speak to this group on one of these calls would be a logical way to do that. And I'm sure they'd be delighted to, and there are presentations and slide decks and working papers on how to make that connection already that's been developed.
That's
excellent. I think it would be time well spent for us because we talk about it so much and probably more as we go along. So getting some foundational, strong information, I think would be great. Okay, terrific, Paul. I like that idea. And a few people are saying yes. So I think we'll proceed down that road. Okay, Dave, why don't you take it back?
Okay. So other issues that need to be considered are testing as you start to venture into a world where you've got a client-side application that is talking to repositories of data using these standards. The testing of all of that interaction is something we should pay attention to. I think many people in healthcare right now, I can tell you, are more focused on let's just try and get something working and then we'll address testing. I think it needs to be considered early on. The definition of APIs, and the other thing is scalability. The applications, are they going to be, if it is a successful application that is used a lot, is it going to be able to keep up the pace of usage? And cloud technologies make that a whole lot easier nowadays, but you've got to design with that in mind. And the last thing that I want to kind of put on the table is one of the things that we've done in healthcare in a group that I've been involved with for many years is developing a proof of concept implementation. So when we go through all of these things, the use cases of transport, authentication, and so forth, to have something that can demonstrate how all of this works and achieves that value in the use case, I think it is great. It's particularly good for educating people, and it may not be that all of the participants are focused on all of the issues. What typically you find is more business-oriented people are going to be involved in the use cases and value proposition. And then as you get more into authentication and authorization, it group that looks at those things. But the issue is if the group can actually work together on a proof of concept, something simple, something that shows the value proposition of interoperability, it's a huge education tool to let people know how you actually go build these things going forward. So with that, I'm going to pause for a moment. Again, many of the upper levels of this, the transport, the authentication, the authorization, and so forth, we can borrow from other industries, particularly healthcare, in my opinion, because they're all very focused on that. And it's the same issue. How do we know this is really Atom? What is Atom allowed to do, and so forth? Same set of issues. When we get into what the data consensus is, that becomes very much more specific to the use case that you're working on. So let me pause here and ask people about their interest in actually taking this from a simple use case and working together. Not everybody's going to be able to do every aspect of this, but working together to understand how this interoperability really does work and what are the areas that we need to focus on moving forward. Again, something that shows value early on, doesn't get excessively complex. So I just want to open the line here for people's feelings about going down a path where we learn more about this.
Dave, this is Paul. I am complete and totally in violent agreement with you on the value of demonstration projects being the way to educate people and show the feasibility and utility of certain information sharing. But I think there's one other dimension to what we need to talk about, and that's the when you go to start doing interoperability across domains, there's another dimension to this beyond what you've already talked about, because people are now concerned about the fact that we have no commonly accepted policies about information sharing that govern the key obstacles that keep people from sharing, and including the cultural and legal and all those things. For just to use your example of authentication and authorization, people, when you start looking at role-based systems to authorize people to see things, you run smack into the fact that there's no real agreement on the secondary use of data. That's much more important an issue when we talk about interoperability than it is when you're talking about sharing within a domain even. As Elliot was saying, these guys were talking about the educational folks and your comments, Dave, about the teacher who said we can share within the district. There's not an issue there about authorization within the district. As soon as you start saying, well, what about sharing your data with law enforcement, for example? Oh, no, we can't do that because they'll abuse the data. That whole, I think a lot of the chaos we see in all of our industries and certainly in interoperability issues is because we don't agree on the basic policies of dealing with consent management, authorization, role-based systems, and this it really boils down to the secondary use of data. I think there are contributions that technologists can make in helping come up with implementable policies. You know, the NIC did a lot of work with this idea of trust marks, which I'm not sure has gone anywhere, but that kind of a concept is really created by technologists and makes a whole lot of sense to me. But those are issues that need to be resolved, and I think we need to think as a group about how to solve them, or find some way to insist that there be some policy determination. I'm also disturbed about this idea of the vendors owning the data in their systems. That's been a troublesome problem in law enforcement as well as health and education and human services. And, that's the kind of policy that's got to be obliterated. That, the data does not belong to the software supplier. It belongs to the people who allowed their data to be shared. And, that maybe it takes a really clear change to the privacy laws in our country, but those policy issues drive a lot of our ability to create the kinds of things you're talking about, Dave, of productive exchange of information in a demonstration model. And somehow we need to at least take those issues into consideration when we talk about interoperability, because it becomes bigger when you're talking about cross-domain information sharing.
Couldn't agree more with you, Paul. That will be on this slide as we move forward, because I think it is a huge issue, and absolutely agree with you. And, of course, the same thing exists in healthcare. EHR vendors tend to believe that all your healthcare data belongs to them, right? Because they can do magic things with it and so forth. And I think that is a bit of what CMS and ONC are trying to do, is to make sure that there's no blocking of information that should be able to be shared and so forth. So you're right, Paul, it's a sticky widget, but I think we can bring some perspectives. We can gather those different viewpoints and see if we can't make some recommendations in that field.
Even some architectural solutions that might help solve that problem.
Yep.
So Dave,
say that again, Paul.
Dan Chavez. I think we got to add a couple things to this list.
Okay.
I think we have to add client identification, which is much different than authorization or authentication. And we need to add consent, which is the client's wishes.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to add data provenance.
Can you tell? So I actually was going to put consent on there. I absolutely agree with you. A couple points of clarification. When you talk about client identity, what are you referring to there? The application client, as in, or yeah,
I'm talking about the individual, the patient, the person.
Okay.
He's really talking about identity resolution.
Right.
Yeah, I'm talking about identity management. The client is Dan Chavez, but his name is Daniel James Chavez. But there's a Dan Chavez, there's a Danny Chavez, there's a DJ Chavez. Which one is it?
Yeah. Yep. And
Dave, I just want to jump in and say, if we want to keep the time, and if people want to stay on, I can. But if we want to keep the time, we need to hear from anybody who wants to speak up and get close to a close.
To this end of, this is Marshall, Identity Resolution and Management, I'm happy to share with you a framework that I've not seen before, but is new and helps to resolve those components. And these can be shared openly. And I know they're participating with sovereign identity, but it's a next level above. It's a huge issue. This having confidence that the person is whom they say they are and the role they play is at the root of all challenges with exchanging or accessing information.
It's step number one.
Yeah.
It's step number one.
Let's open it up. If anybody is going to have to leave right on the hour, please speak up now.
This is Paul. I apologize, but I got to go catch an airplane.
Okay, Paul.
Great, Paul, thank you.
Dan Chavez has got to go as well. Good day.
Yeah.
Dan, nice to hear your voice. Thank you.
And Elliot's got to go. I've got a research conference I've got to tune into.
Yeah, I'm thinking we should probably wrap up, and I'll send some notes, just outline notes to everybody, and if you want to add to them, please feel free. And what does anybody think about holding a meeting next week, which is right after 4th of July, or should we give it a rest for a week?
That is a tricky one for people who vacation. We might want to consider the next week focusing on this number one topic, which is around identity solution, management, requirements, confidentiality. It is the root. And so it's worth, particularly if we can have Dan participate and some of the folks who've been in the weeds of how everything falls apart.
That would be great. That would be great.
Marie Gonzalez.
But let me just, it's 1 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of people's time. By real quick voice, do we hold a meeting next Friday, or do we give it a week's rest?
I think we should give it a rest.
Others?
I second that.
I agree.
Okay. All right, that's enough voices. Thank you. So we'll send out an appropriate note. Thank you. Yeah, go on, sorry.
No, I was just going to thank folks because it seems like a good number of people have to leave. So I just wanted to thank everybody, and I'll add the issues to the list and we'll continue on.
Terrific. Terrific meeting. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Have a wonderful weekend.
Okay.